Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an airline pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. A question I'm being asked a lot on my live streams is how did flight simulation actually help me in my pilot training career and in my type rating? So let's try to answer these now. First of all, a little bit of background. I had started with flight simulation long before I actually started with real aviation, and my very first real aviation experience was flying gliders at the age of 15 years old. But let's focus this video on a little bit later time, so let's start with the private pilot license. How did flight simulation help me obtain my private pilot license? Now, of course I had 3 years of glider flying experience by the time I started my PPL, and many more years experience flying in flight simulators, all different kinds of aircraft type. But when I started my PPL, which I did mainly on the Cessna 172 and the Piper 28, but for the vast majority of it on the Cessna 172, I did of course buy the A28 Cessna 172, which at that time was the big 172 add-on that actually covered the airplane in the greatest detail available, and I believe it's actually even in the greatest detail available to date, at least for FSX and P3D. I have never tried that Cessna 172 for X-plane, so I can't comment on that. And of course the default MSFS Cessna does not count. Well, it still can't hold up to the A2A, so it doesn't count anyway. So, of course, interpreting the instruments, expecting how the engine is going to behave, that's all kind of stuff that you could learn in Flight Simulator. And so that is stuff that I have been pretty good at in the real experience. Now, with the real experience from flying gliders, it was actually not too hard to get accustomed to flying the Cessna 172 based on the experience that I had collected in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So I basically had an idea already how aircraft are flying, and then I just continued from there on. So that is more or less my PPL. And now let's move on into the airline transport pilot license. Basically, the flight simulator really aided me in the theoretical lessons, as well as in the practical ones, but mainly in the theoreticals, because a lot of that theory is, well, very theoretical and pretty hard to imagine if you are hearing it for the first time. So what I've noticed a lot is that classmates had to learn stuff by heart that I could actually follow up and understand because I just knew the backgrounds and I could draw a mental picture up of many of the things. So it starts very easily, like you have an RMI and it's giving you these deflections. Where is the station? You know, stuff like that. Where are you based on these instruments? But then also the more difficult stuff, like, for example, what do the fuel pumps run on? Are they AC driven? Are they DC driven? How does an IRS work? What is the attitude mode doing on the IRS? Which information can you access on the different navigation display pages? And of course also some background, like for example, how does an ILS work? That's all stuff that I could learn from Flight Simulator, and that actually really helped me in my theoretical instructions. Now, moving on from there into the practical lessons, of course, flying on instruments is something that I was really used to from Flight Simulator. So for me, the transition from flying VFR to flying IFR was a fairly easy one, and it didn't really take a lot. Of course, there is a lot of fine-tuning that the instructors are going to do with you on all different kind of points in the flights. So don't get me wrong, don't expect that you can actually learn how to fly from flight simulators, but you can get some basics, and if you have those basics, you can focus on the fine-tuning that the instructors are going to do with you. I believe for me personally that's been a very good combination. Now comes the big thing. Until here, I've flown Cessnas, I've flown Pipers, I've flown multi-engine Pipers, but that's it. Moving on to the type rating, flying an actual airliner. And by coincidence, it happened to be one sorry, by coincidence. It happened to be one that actually used to be among my favorites in the flight simulator add-ons that were available at the time, and that was the Boeing 737. And I've had so many years of experience with the PMDG 737 by then. I really wouldn't want to say that I believe, or that I believed that I knew it all, because by that point, I definitely knew that I did absolutely not know it all, as some flight simmers seem to think. And when we started with the theory, following up on a lot of those systems was actually fairly easy. Learning the flight management computer, that was straightforward. I could just use the PMDG 737 NGX to learn my SOPs and to learn how those systems worked, how the autopilot worked. But the autopilot actually serves as a very good example that there are some major differences between the real airplane and a simulated one. So PMDG simulates an aircraft using common VNAV. Now let's be honest with you, how many of you have even heard the term common VNAV? It won't be a lot of you, except for those who have either listened to my channel or who followed along very, very carefully in the PMDG forums. Or maybe some of you have downloaded and read Navcom. But there are different types of VNAV available on the plane, and even within VNAV there are several different options on how it can be made to work. So my airline had basic VNAV at the time that I actually did my type rating. In other words, that meant that no geometric descent was implemented, and basically when you hit the VNAV button, it went into the VNAV path and went into a dive to catch that path, regardless of the speed. In theory, of course, it would prevent an overspeed by reverting into level change, but I never wanted to let it go that far that I could actually test that out. Well, and then of course we sat in the simulator briefing room. The instructor asked questions like, alright, so you have the following FMA, now you press that button, what do you expect to happen? I of course replied with what would happen on the NGX, but the instructor, being an instructor of my airline, and he had actually never flown in another airline, he was like, what the hell are you talking about, VNAV alt? That mode doesn't exist. And, well, there it went. And there went my excellent grade. Because, of course, I kept insisting, like, yeah, but if I do this, then it should do that. No, it shouldn't. But at that point, I had never heard the term common VNAV. Of course, our AFCOM back then didn't mention it either. Now, about 2 years ago, or maybe even 1 year ago, my airline did actually introduce common VNAV. So by that point, I was like, oh, now I know what the new system is going to work like, and I can maybe, I don't want to say impress some of the captains, because that's not what it's about, not at all, and that is not what it was about for me back then, but, you know, I more or less had the knowledge, while many other people had to study manuals. And then I quickly discovered that just because it had common VNAV, it did not have geometric descent. So it's still leveled out after a descent constraint until the next stop of descent. Well, there we go, guys. That is pretty much differences between flight simulation and real life. Now, PMDG of course simulated VNAV correctly, but one of the several different versions that are available by Boeing. And you don't necessarily know that when you come from flight simulation. So, in the end, I have to say that flight simulation really helped me during my whole flight training. After all, my simulator partner and myself passed the license skill check with excellent grades, and personally I had a feeling that the type rating went quite a bit more relaxed for us than it did for some of the other colleagues in my course who had to study with the paper mock-ups and so on. After all, what is my opinion then? If you are a flight simmer already and you want to do an ATPL, well, I have to tell you, you still need to study the whole thing. First of all, because depending on how close or not you work to the books in Flight Simulator, chances are that you have learned incorrect habits, and those will have to be corrected, of course. Also, you will absolutely not have the full picture of everything going on around you. It would be foolish to believe that in Flight Simulator you taught yourself everything and there is nothing more for you to learn. If that is your opinion, then probably don't even attempt to become a pilot, because that is something that will sooner or later kill you. Nonetheless, Flight Simulator does help you very much, and Flight Simulator does make it easier. But you still have to work very, very hard becoming an airline pilot. There is no way around it. And after all, it is a great fun experience. And honestly, I have to say that flight training was probably the best time of my life. So we'll see how that's going to develop, of course. But nonetheless, I hope you found this interesting. I'm looking forward to see you all in the coming days in the virtual skies. And leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. And I'm interested to hear in the comments, what do you think about this? Do you think that my story is exceptional? Probably not even in a positive way, but in a very negative way. Or have you probably made a similar experience? If you're an airline pilot out there watching this, or if you are in flight training, then let me know what you think. What is your experience coming from Flight Simulator and doing the airline pilot license? But for now, thank you very much for watching. Wishing you all great afternoon, evening, weekend, whatever it is, wherever you are watching this. Thank you for your attention, and see you all on the next one.